Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
They say you never forget the moment someone makes you feel small on purpose. And I can tell you the color of the tablecloth that night, the pattern on the wine glass I was holding, and the exact way my mom's voice cut through the clink of silverware like a blade. You'll never be as beautiful or accomplished as your sister. That was it. No build-up, no warning, just a casually cruel declaration, dropped like a plate on tile, loud enough that even my dad blinked up from his roast lamb. And what made it worse, what always made it worse, was the fact that no one said anything. My father cleared his throat and reached for the salt. Rachel giggled awkwardly and swirled her wine like this was just another Tuesday. And I, the apparent underachiever, the supposedly less beautiful one, simply folded my napkin, stood, and started gathering the plates like I'd done something wrong by existing. That dinner, like 1,000 others before it, wasn't meant to celebrate anything. It wasn't a birthday or an anniversary or even a reunion. It was just another obligatory Sunday where my mother cooked something dry, poured too much wine, and rehearsed the same performance she'd been giving since Rachel and I were teenagers, the golden child and the other one. Rachel, with her picture-perfect family and impossibly clean SUV, always arriving 15 minutes late in heels she didn't need, and a laugh that came with just a hint of pity whenever she greeted me. And me, Ellie, 39, single, childless, freelance editor who lived in a one-bedroom apartment with 2 cats and a stubborn refusal to overshare. I was the quiet one, the polite one, the one who got the hand-me-down insults and was expected to be grateful they were still warm. But something shifted that night, not in the words, because those were familiar, but in the silence that followed them. I realized, as I stood at the sink with dish soap on my hands and chicken bones scraping porcelain, that I wasn't hurt. Not anymore. I was finished. I wasn't going to fight or cry or attempt some grand speech about fairness or respect, or how it felt to be treated like the dull backdrop to my sister's performance. No, I was going to be still. I was going to listen. And then I was going to dismantle the whole damn show, piece by piece, without anyone realizing the curtain was falling. You have to understand, I'm not the type to break things. I've always been the fixer. The one who stepped in when Rachel forgot Mom's birthday, who helped clean out Dad's garage when his back went out, who edited Rachel's master's thesis for free and never once reminded her of it. I'm the one who says thank you when she's insulted and writes thank you cards for socks at Christmas. But that night, while they poured another round of wine and laughed about Rachel's latest real estate flip, I made a decision. Not loud, not angry, not even conscious at first, but a decision nonetheless. I was going to take something back. Not vengeance, not even justice, just balance. I didn't need to invent a lie or exaggerate a truth. I only needed to start turning over stones that had been sitting, untouched, for decades. And in families like mine, with mothers like Karen Morgan, you don't have to dig very far before something starts to smell. The thing about women like her is they don't believe they've done anything wrong. They think cruelty is honesty and favoritism is just knowing potential. They build myths about their children, prop them up like furniture, and then act surprised when one leg finally snaps. When the evening ended, Rachel hugged me like someone congratulating a coworker who didn't get the promotion, and Mom kissed my cheek like she always did, like she was forgiving me for something I hadn't done. I let them. I smiled. I said goodbye. And then I sat in my car with the engine off for 20 minutes, watching the windows of my childhood home glow gold behind the curtains. And I let one thought settle deep into my chest like a stone in water. What would happen if I stopped playing my part? The next morning, I called no one. I replied to no texts. I didn't cry or rant or write a journal entry begging the universe for closure. I opened a folder on my laptop labeled Morgan Archives that I hadn't touched in years. It had everything: scanned copies of old letters, family financial records, clippings from our hometown paper, even a few old voicemails from Dad I'd saved out of guilt. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, sat in the quiet of my small apartment, and began reading slowly, carefully, like a stranger studying a case file. Not because I wanted revenge, not even because I was angry, but because I was curious what I'd find if I finally stopped assuming they loved me in the way I needed, and started treating them like the people they actually were. That week, Rachel posted a photo on Instagram of her family at a vineyard, hashtagging it #blessed #family first. Mom commented a string of hearts. I didn't like the photo. I didn't even open it. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with someone I hadn't spoken to in over 10 years, an old classmate who'd gone into estate law. We weren't close, but she'd always liked me more than Rachel, and that was enough. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I just asked her one question. What happens if someone's estate was built on someone else's story? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled. Depends how well the story holds up under pressure. And that was when I knew I didn't need to fight my family. I just needed to let go of the silence, of the fear, of the need to protect them from themselves. Because if you stop holding up the roof and the whole thing caves in, that's not sabotage. That's gravity. And I had a lot of gravity left in me, but none of that was visible to my family. Not yet. To them, I was still Ellie, still the quiet one. Still the one who brought pie and offered to clean up, even when nobody helped her. And that was good. That was perfect. Because you never notice the fuse until it's already lit. And by the time they smelled the smoke, I'd already walked away. It's strange how quiet life gets once you stop trying to be understood by people who never really listened in the first place. And in the days following that dinner, after the plates were washed, the family group chat lit up with filtered photos of Rachel's kids, and the moment of humiliation faded into yet another unacknowledged bruise on the long, invisible map of my patience. I found myself oddly calm, as if the decision to no longer perform had created a strange kind of silence I didn't know I needed. There was no ceremony to it, no great declaration of war, no slamming of doors or written letters explaining my absence, just a quiet recalibration, like adjusting a picture frame you've walked past 1,000 times and only now realized has always been crooked. It began, not with a scream, but with a Google search. The name I typed in wasn't unfamiliar, though it had collected some dust in the back corners of my memory. Cassandra Lee, a former roommate from grad school who used to fall asleep on her contracts textbook and joke that someday, when she made partner, she'd only take cases that felt personal. She had transferred out halfway through the program after a bitter split with her professor boyfriend and moved back to Boston, where she promptly rebranded herself into a sharp, glass-cutting estate law machine with a reputation for precision and a startling memory for names. I hadn't spoken to her in over a decade, but I remembered how she had always looked me in the eye, never past me, never through me, never with that patronizing squint so many people used when trying to locate my worth in the shadows of my sister's shine. The email I sent was brief, polite, and laced with just enough nostalgia to keep it human. Hey Cass, long time. I'm in town for a bit and came across something odd in an old family file. Not sure if it's anything, but I'd love your eyes on it. Coffee on me? She replied within an hour, attaching her assistant scheduler and a signature block that made my stomach flutter, not with envy, but with the electric realization that people do, in fact, grow into the bones they've built, if given the space. Her office was on the 32nd floor of a sleek glass building with polished floors and a receptionist who wore a headset like a crown. Cassandra had not changed much. Still tall, still decisive, still allergic to small talk. And as I placed the manila folder between us at the coffee table in her private corner office, I could tell she was already cataloging the weight of the moment. Inside the folder were documents I'd scanned and saved years ago, items I hadn't known what to do with until that dinner finally clicked something loose in me. My father's will, insurance policies I'd never seen notarized, an old deed to a property I'd never heard them mention, but which somehow bore my social security number in a place it shouldn't have been. And then there was the photo, grainy, dated, folded in the center, of my mother and Rachel standing outside a lawyer's office, smiling in a way I'd never seen aimed at me, with a title beneath it clipped from the local paper. Family legacy passed to the next generation. The name listed under heir wasn't Rachel's legal last name at the time. It wasn't even spelled right, but the implications were loud enough to drown out logic. Cassandra leafed through the document slowly, her long fingers tapping the table every few pages, her mouth tightening into a thin, thoughtful line. When she finally looked up, there wasn't pity in her eyes. There was calculation. "Ellie," she said, voice even, "what exactly do you want to happen?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because the answer felt like a door I couldn't unopen. I didn't want money. I didn't want an apology, especially not the brittle kind that came too late and wrapped itself in guilt rather than remorse. What I wanted, what I needed, was for the story to stop repeating. I wanted the weight of every less than and not quite, and you'll never be to land finally where it belonged, with the people who said them, not the one who swallowed them. I want the truth to hurt a little, I said finally. I want it to make noise. And so we began, quietly, surgically, without blood or broken glass. Cassandra helped me file a Freedom of Information request for a tax discrepancy from the early 90s related to my parents' now defunct landscaping business, a business my mother had once boasted they sold for a healthy sum when Rachel started high school. She drafted an anonymous tip to the city's zoning department, flagging a permit that had never been finalized on my parents' second property. She flagged a trust fund document that, upon closer inspection, listed me as a minor beneficiary who had never been notified of her status or her removal. We weren't launching grenades. We were pulling at loose threads and letting the fabric decide how fast it unraveled. At the same time, I mailed an envelope, no return address, to the editorial desk of the Bradford Chronicle, the same small-town paper that had run a profile piece on Rachel's real estate empire 5 years ago, praising her for rebuilding the same community that raised her. Inside was a photocopy of an ethics complaint from a former buyer, alleging misrepresentation of property lines and a shady escrow handoff that had been quietly buried but not erased. I knew the editor. He had taught a journalism workshop I took as a bored teenager. He owed me nothing, but he loved a story, and Rachel, unfortunately for her, had become one. And through it all, I smiled. I answered my mother's calls with cheerful monotony. I liked Rachel's posts. I even commented on one, a photo of her at a charity gala in a borrowed dress that had once belonged to our grandmother, a woman who'd whispered to me on her deathbed, "You got the brains, sweetheart, but you'll need a stronger spine." I told her she looked lovely. I told her I hoped she'd had fun. Meanwhile, I found the old box of documents buried in Dad's basement under a pile of golf trophies and VHS tapes labeled Rachel's First Steps and Rachel's Piano Recital. There were no tapes of me, not a single one. But there, tucked in the back, was something I wasn't meant to find. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to Rachel in a hand I didn't recognize. The postmark was from New Jersey. Inside was a single page, no greeting, no sign-off, just one line in slanted ink. "Tell her before she finds out on her own. You owe her that much." I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't storm upstairs or confront my parents. I didn't even ask who her was. I already knew. The earthquake had begun, but no one at Sunday dinner felt the tremors yet. They still thought I was just Ellie, folding napkins, clearing plates, waiting quietly at the edge of someone else's story. Let them think that. The fault line had been there all along. I had just finally learned how to press. There is a kind of satisfaction, slow, quiet, almost medicinal, that comes not from shouting at the people who hurt you, but from watching the ripple of consequences reach them on a day when the sky is blue and they expect nothing but comfort. It was precisely that kind of day when Rachel called me, her voice laced with something I hadn't heard since we were children, and she'd broken our neighbor's window with a baseball. Uncertainty. Her tone was too polite, too curious, a little too sweet, like she was trying to pull off concern in a voice that had only ever known control. "Hey, Elle," she said, dragging my name out like we'd been chatting every day, like we weren't two strangers stitched together by blood and 1,000 moments of silence that had grown louder with time. Random question. You didn't happen to say anything weird to Mom lately, did you? I told her I hadn't spoken to Mom since Sunday dinner, which was true, though truth, I was learning, had layers. And this was the kind I'd learned to deliver with a straight face and a dry throat. She paused on the line like she was trying to sense the air behind my voice, then mumbled something about Mom being in a mood, and then quickly pivoted to a story about one of her kids winning a spelling bee. I let her talk. I let her fill the space with her usual glittery noise. But all the while, I watched the little green bar flash across my computer screen as a legal database downloaded documents I should never have had access to. Documents I had requested through a loophole Cassandra had discovered, using the alias we'd crafted together one long afternoon over coffee and sardonic laughter. What I had now wasn't just family trivia or old gossip. It was evidence, receipts, a trail of filings, amendments, and notarized statements that painted a very different picture of the Morgan household legacy, one where certain trust accounts had been dissolved quietly and reassembled under different names, one where Rachel's first business venture, the one Mom had always proudly described as self-made, had actually been floated on an inheritance. Rachel wasn't technically entitled to receive a loan, and one where a signature, Dad's, appeared on 3 separate forms that Cassandra confirmed had been filed after the date of his documented heart surgery, a time during which he'd been sedated and, according to hospital logs, incapable of signing his own discharge forms, let alone complex legal documents. What this meant, in plain terms, was that someone, most likely my mother, had used her husband's name, his illness, and the window of confusion following his operation to push through paperwork that favored Rachel financially, permanently, and entirely. It also meant that Rachel, whether complicit or merely willfully ignorant, had been living in a house built on forged signatures and unequal distributions, all while delivering speeches at charity galas about resilience and family values. I didn't plan to use the documents, not yet. What I needed was timing. Timing was everything in stories like these. If you drop the truth too early, people deny it. Too late, and they've already buried the evidence. But if you time it just right, just when the world is watching and the subject is least prepared, you don't just shift perception. You undo foundations. So I waited, and I listened. That same week, Rachel's youngest was pulled from her private school after the school board discovered irregularities in the donor list connected to a scholarship fund named after our grandfather. A fund that, according to newly surfaced documents, had been fed by shell accounts linked to Rachel's real estate ventures. Rachel called me again, more frantic this time, asking if I'd seen anything off in our family's finances or heard anything strange from people in town. I told her I hadn't, which again was technically true. I hadn't heard it. I'd found it, documented it, and distributed it in sealed envelopes to 3 key contacts, one at the Chronicle, one at the tax office, and one anonymously to a woman Rachel had fired 3 years ago for attitude problems after she got pregnant. And yet, I still hadn't said a word to Mom. I didn't need to, because something more satisfying was happening. My mother was beginning to unravel, not publicly, not dramatically, but in subtle, jagged little ways that only I would recognize. She began calling me at odd hours, leaving voice messages that rambled and reversed themselves, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, and most tellingly, if I remembered that talk we had about the house. We had never had a talk about the house, but clearly she thought we had, or wished we had, because the paranoia had begun to rot her clarity. In one voicemail, she said she missed having me over. In another, she asked if I'd seen the church bulletin and whether I'd talked to that boy from high school who worked at the bank now. I hadn't. But it told me something crucial. She didn't know where the leak was coming from. That terrified her. And that was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't just pulling threads anymore. I was weaving a net. And they were stepping into it willingly, day by day, as they scrambled to plug holes in a narrative they didn't realize was already in freefall. Then came the final click. A document arrived via courier, unsigned, unrequested, but with a note attached. Thought you might be interested. It was a property reassignment form. Land transferred from my grandfather to my mother, then from my mother to Rachel, with no mention of me. This wasn't illegal, but it was deliberate. It confirmed, in ink, what I had always felt in bone. I was never part of the plan. I was never meant to inherit anything. Not land, not money, not stories. I was the witness, the placeholder, the one expected to clap from the sidelines and smile wide enough to keep the cracks from showing. So I started writing. Not a letter, not a confession, but a document, a quiet retelling backed by dates, citations, and records, labeled Timeline of Distribution Discrepancies, Morgan Family. I didn't sign my name. I didn't have to. I left a copy in my mother's mailbox on a Tuesday morning. No note, no threat. Just the truth, laid out like puzzle pieces. The kind you can't look away from once you start putting them together. That night, Rachel called again. I let it ring, because she doesn't know, she's never known, that the person you push to the corner doesn't disappear. She just learns how to move without being seen. And now, she's everywhere. There's a peculiar moment in every long game where silence becomes louder than action. And it was on a Thursday morning, cloudless, uneventful, the kind of day suburban mothers bake banana bread and check the mail in house slippers, that my mother simply stopped answering her phone. No explanations, no updates in the family group chat, no passive-aggressive emails forwarding news articles I didn't ask for. Just stillness, stretched over the Morgan household like plastic wrap over old leftovers, tight and strangely shiny. Rachel noticed first, of course, and predictably turned it into a performance, calling me with her voice pitched just slightly above casual concern, trying to package panic inside her usual blend of self-importance and sugar-coated crisis management, as if I hadn't been watching this house of cards lean for weeks. She hasn't returned any of my texts, Rachel said, somewhere between irritation and fear, like our mother was a disappointing assistant, not a 71-year-old woman potentially unraveling behind drawn blinds. And Dad says she's just resting, but he sounded weird, like distracted. I let her talk, humming in the appropriate places, giving her the illusion of collaboration while carefully not offering a single piece of new information. Because while she was spinning in circles of shallow worry, I was already a chapter ahead, standing calmly at the edge of a story she hadn't realized was hers to lose. The truth was, Karen Morgan hadn't disappeared so much as she had retreated. Not physically, not yet, but psychologically, into the kind of defensive crouch reserved for people who suspect a reckoning is approaching and for the first time in their well-controlled lives, don't know exactly who's bringing it. My mother, for all her cruelty and clipped tones, had never been stupid. She had known, perhaps even the night of that dinner, that something inside me had shifted. But she, like so many who mistake silence for weakness, had underestimated what it meant for someone like me to stop absorbing damage and start taking notes. The clues began to surface in the quiet spaces, the tiny gaps where her presence used to dominate, her absence at Sunday brunch, her failure to respond to the local neighborhood group on Facebook, her sudden unavailability for church events where she'd normally bark orders about centerpieces and hymn selections. The house, once a buzzing hive of judgment and performance, was now just a location on Google Maps, with its curtains permanently drawn and its mailbox growing fat with unopened envelopes. Rachel, in a panic disguised as efficiency, sent a grocery delivery to the house and texted me a screenshot of the receipt, as if that somehow proved she was doing her part. I didn't reply. Instead, I met Cassandra again, this time not in her office, but in a neutral, unremarkable cafe on the edge of the city. The kind of place where people speak in hushed tones, not because they're being secretive, but because the walls carry sound. Cassandra had a folder with her, one she slid across the table with a deliberate calm that made my stomach turn. not out of fear, but out of the heavy satisfaction of knowing the final few pieces were finally in place. Inside the folder were copies of recently filed inquiries from 3 different agencies: the IRS, the State Property Board, and a small but dogged local journalism collective known for publishing uncomfortable truths on quiet Tuesdays when nobody was paying attention. All 3 had received anonymous tips, well-sourced, well-organized, and timed with surgical precision. And all 3 had begun knocking softly at the door of a woman who had spent her entire life pretending the rules didn't apply to her because she could smile and host a dinner party. What Rachel didn't know, and what Mom had likely started to suspect, was that this wasn't just about money or favoritism anymore. It was about identity, about legacy, about the slow, relentless exposure of a lie that had been dressed up in pearls and roasted chicken and Sunday school morality. The forged documents Cassandra uncovered weren't just suspicious. They were actionable. And while prosecution was unlikely, no one was calling the FBI. Reputation was a currency in our town, and Karen Morgan's balance was suddenly overdrawn. Her carefully curated image of the dignified matriarch, the family's moral compass, the smiling church secretary who always brought lemon bars to bake sales, was now being quietly dissected by people who used to admire her. And then came the letter. It arrived at my door late in the evening, hand-delivered by someone who didn't leave a name, just a brown envelope with no stamp, and my name written in my mother's handwriting, the kind she reserved for birthday cards and family recipe note cards. Inside were 3 pages, lined, handwritten, no greeting, no date. It wasn't quite an apology. Karen Morgan did not apologize. It was more of a reckoning, a spiraling list of thoughts and fragments, some defensive, some bitter, a few startlingly honest. She wrote about Rachel, how she had always been easy to praise, because Rachel asked for it the way a child demands sugar, relentlessly and loudly. She wrote about me, not with warmth, not even with regret, but with something closer to curiosity, as if she were describing a room she had lived in for decades, but only now realized had a window. I never knew what you wanted from me, she wrote. You never asked. You never demanded. Rachel took up all the space. You absorbed everything, and I mistook that for resilience. There was a line near the end that I read 3 times before it landed fully. I think I was afraid of you, even when you were small. You reminded me too much of myself before I decided to survive by becoming someone else. There was no signature, just that final thought. I didn't call her. I didn't rush to soften the blow, because I knew somewhere deep beneath the bruised layers of my upbringing that this wasn't a moment for reconciliation. It was a moment of symmetry, of the scales finally tilting, not through rage or chaos, but through deliberate, clinical exposure. The truth had been quiet for too long, and now it was echoing, even in the silence of a house where the porch light no longer came on at dusk. Rachel called again that night. This time, she didn't lead with small talk. What did you do? She asked, a voice brittle, furious, scared. And I answered honestly because I owed myself that much. I stopped lying for her. Then I hung up, poured myself a drink, and waited, because the storm had arrived. And for once, I was dry. There's something profoundly strange about watching the people who raised you flinch at shadows they can no longer name, especially when those shadows are simply truths they've spent a lifetime stepping over, truths you've stopped sweeping under the rug on their behalf. I hadn't intended to become the architect of my mother's unraveling, not really, and I certainly hadn't set out to turn Rachel's world into a house of glass exposed to the first good gust of public scrutiny. But somewhere between being told I'd never be as beautiful or accomplished and realizing no one in that room would ever think to question it, I had begun to understand something more dangerous than anger. I had leverage, not because I had power, but because I no longer needed anything from them. The irony, of course, was that the real damage hadn't come from anything I had shouted or destroyed or confessed in dramatic, cathartic confrontation. It had come from the quiet letting go, The calm decision to stop playing a role in a narrative that had never fit. To stop propping up their illusions with my obedience and emotional labor. I had said nothing cruel. I had made no accusations. All I had done was stop lying on their behalf. And like oxygen introduced to a slow-burning fire, that silence had exploded into consequence. The text came on a Sunday night, at a time when Rachel would normally be uploading her curated photo dump of the weekend's family activities. Vineyard tours, overpriced brunches, the occasional beach photo filtered into oblivion. But instead, there was nothing on her feed except stillness. And then suddenly, at 8:47 p.m., the screen lit up with the kind of message that sits in your chest like a swallowed stone. Call me. Mom's been crying nonstop. What did you do? I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what she wanted me to say, and how carefully she was hoping I'd offer some kind of rationale she could weaponize. Some statement that would let her believe I had finally become the villain she always secretly feared I might be. But I wasn't going to give her that. Not now, not after all of this. Because what I had done wasn't sabotage, and it wasn't revenge, at least not in the cartoonish way people like Rachel imagined it. There had been no screaming, no exposed affairs or financial ruin or arrests. What I had done was lift the veil, slowly, with surgical precision, and let the truth breathe. Truth about our family's unequal sacrifices, about the false narratives my mother had told to justify her favoritism, about the money that had quietly changed hands without legal clarity or ethical thought, about the way I had been erased from the family's forward-facing mythology, with the kind of grace that makes you wonder whether it was ever really accidental. But before the text, before the tearful voicemails, before Rachel's sudden crisis of control, there was a moment I haven't told anyone about, a moment that didn't involve lawyers or documents or strategies, but something far simpler, far more human. It was 2 weeks before the text, and I had gone by the house, not to confront, not even to speak. I had simply stood across the street, leaning against my car, sipping the worst gas station coffee imaginable, watching as the porch light flickered unevenly against the falling dusk. My father was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes with the same absent repetition he'd always applied to problems he couldn't fix. My mother was visible through the kitchen window, moving slowly, like someone carrying something heavy you couldn't quite see. She opened the fridge, closed it, stood still. She looked tired in a way I'd never noticed before, not just physically but spiritually, like someone finally hearing the echoes of all the words she'd said, as if for the first time. And for a moment, just one, I almost pitied her. But pity is cheap, and healing is not a gift you owe to the person who broke you, especially when they've never asked for it in a language that sounds anything like remorse. So I left. I didn't wave. I didn't knock. I simply turned the key in the ignition and drove away, knowing that whatever story they would tell about me from here on out would be missing the one ingredient they always took for granted, my silence. Rachel never got her call. I never wrote back. But that didn't stop the story from spreading, from neighbors exchanging glances, from church committees quietly removing Karen Morgan from planning roles, from whispers about legal reviews and quiet settlements. And yet, no one could quite say what had happened. There had been no explosion, no collapse, just a quiet shift in air pressure, a recalibration of who held the floor in the Morgan legacy. I moved 3 weeks later, not far, just enough to be out of reach, but still within earshot of the echoes. Cassandra helped me close on a modest little place with a better view and no ghosts. I brought the cats. I brought the folder. I brought a single photograph. Me at age 7, sitting at a piano, eyes wide, smile cautious. My mother had never framed that one. Sometimes I stare at it and wonder what that little girl would have said if you told her it would take nearly 40 years for anyone to hear her. I think she'd laugh. I think she'd say, "Of course it did." Because some stories aren't loud. Some revenge doesn't need to be messy. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is leave someone alone with the truth and simply walk away. And sometimes the final act of power is not returning the call. So when Rachel texted me a second time, "Seriously, call me. What did you do to her?" I put the phone down, looked out the window at the rain starting to fall, and whispered aloud to no one in particular, "I did nothing." And then I smiled, because I knew that was the part they'd never understand.